Welcome to the second part of our conversation with Professor John Kay. In our previous episode, we explored why individualism, despite its failures, remains so resilient. Now we will shift from diagnosis to solutions. What might communitarian capitalism look like? How can we redesign corporations, governments, and even technology to serve a shared purpose rather than a narrow self-interest? Professor Kay, if stakeholder capitalism is the economic face of communitarianism, what's the most realistic path for getting there, especially when quarterly earnings and shareholder primacy still very much dominate boardrooms?
It's saying that the real job of management is managing the not always compatible expectations and desires of the stakeholders in an organization. And the organizations that have been successful in the long run have been ones that have managed these kind of balances. That means they're very far from indifferent to their shareholders, but making money for their shareholders has generally been something that followed from the success of the business, rather than being the nature of the success of the business. We talked in an earlier episode about Boeing as one of the great companies of the 20th century, and how it built that shared purpose round about building great airplanes that people around the world wanted to travel in and were able to travel in a way they hadn't been before. I talk a lot about Britain's most successful corporation of the 20th century, which was ICI, Imperial Chemical Industries.
Yes.
And the story of ICI is of a business which began in dyestuffs and explosives. It understood that its competitive advantage lay in chemistry, and that its competitive success lay in being able to go on attracting bright chemists along with bright managers from British universities. And it began, as I say, in explosives and dyestuffs. It moved to petrochemicals and fertilizers in the 1930s. It then moved into materials, polyester, nylon, and the like, and then into pharmaceuticals during the Second World War. And at the end of the Second World War, they set up a pharmaceutical division that actually lost money for 20 years, but eventually came up with blockbuster drugs, which turned out towards the end of the century to be the principal profit earners for the company. That was a company whose, they said in their mission statement that the purpose of ICI is the responsible application of chemistry and related sciences to business. And that was what they did in these diverse, somewhat diverse, but not completely unrelated areas, ending in pharmacology. It's also a story that has a very clear ending, which is in the last decade, in the 1990s. They announced that our objective is to create value for shareholders by focusing on businesses in which we have cost leadership and a strong market position. And that business lasted 15 years before the rump of ICI was finally acquired by a Dutch company, in fact, in the early 2000s. What's devastating in Britain is that I can tell almost the same story about Britain's second largest industrial company of the 20th century, which was GEC, Britain's leading electrical company, which also moved from its diverse electrical interests to focusing on creating shareholder value, and essentially blew itself up by acquiring businesses at silly prices in the dot-com boom. and no longer exists. That's a devastating story for someone from Britain about how the largest two companies of the most successful industrial companies in the 20th century blew themselves up essentially by misunderstanding the nature and purpose of the business they were creating. And I think everyone ought to learn from the lessons from that. And one can learn these lessons over and over again. We talked in our earlier discussion about Boeing, about American General Electric, and about the way these companies, about IBM, had dominant market positions, which they gave up by not really understanding the nature of competitive advantage and the nature of building great long-term businesses.
Absolutely. And I'd probably argue that even in the current times, Unilever is another example, which probably is in the process of giving up stakeholder focus and moving towards shareholder returns. I think you also speak briefly of Apple in your book, which had started a shift towards stakeholder capitalism, but it seems to have brought its focus back into shareholder returns. Why is this so inevitable? It almost feels like every company which has started its shift towards stakeholder focus has given it up at some point and moved back to the shareholder.
I think a lot of this is pressure from financial markets, and with the developments I've been describing, the movement away from these broadly based multi-activity companies to, well, I talked about ICI saying our new mission is to create shareholder value by focusing on businesses in which we have cost leadership and a world-leading position. And that isn't a way of building businesses for the future. You don't know what the best business way of building great businesses for the future is. And Apple, which we mentioned, is an interesting example in that Apple nearly died so many times before it actually succeeded. And we will now see how long the Apple succeeded by essentially pioneering the smartphone, the multi-purpose computer that is in our pockets. And I have a slide which I quite often use to illustrate the nature of what Apple did, which was the iPhone doesn't do anything that you couldn't do before. It was a sat nav, it was a phone, it was a pager, it was a music library, it was a book library, and so all these facilities existed. The brilliant thing was actually putting them all together in a single device we could carry around. And that's the nature of modern business. It's evolving collections of capabilities from collections of people, because it's also true that Apple was only able to do that because it had coders, designers, effective assembly plants in China, and so on. The successful business is about putting together capabilities in this kind of way and putting together capabilities to do things that weren't available before, not brilliantly novel things. We all had phones before we had smartphones. The attraction of the smartphone is the range of things it does on the device we have in our pockets.
Absolutely. I want to ask you one specific question regarding a country like India, where families tend to dominate the business landscape, right? And that whole idea seems to be somehow antithetical to a communitarian model in some ways. Is there a path that you see that stakeholder models and communitarian models can be relevant in countries like India?
I'm not sure it is antithetical. You know, a lot of successful businesses were based uh, on the kind of leadership that is not the idolization of great men, but actually people who were committed to developing the business. And if I move away from Britain and the United States, and so much of what is written about business is written as, well, pretty much as if the United States was where business was conducted. So sometimes bit about Britain catches on. But in continental Europe, family ownership has been much more
Yes.
important and enduring than it has been in Britain or the US. And one of the consequences of that has been families who were not and the successors were not necessarily great at running businesses, but
Yes.
they were great at understanding the need for continuity in running the business and the need to recruit successful generations of management teams who could develop these businesses. So I wouldn't be pessimistic necessarily about the fact that uh, families in India have had this large role in having control of great businesses.
Fair enough. Uh, are there models that you see, cooperatives, public interest corporations, social enterprises, that you see as great examples of how communitarian principles work in action? Would you like to highlight some of them?
Well, I think there's an issues there we need to distinguish. There is a lot of um, looking for different ownership or structural uh, models in legal terms for running the business, which is a separate issue from the way people in the business think about the business. So I talked about Boeing or ICI or other companies which were run in the way I'm describing. It's the world of people who at Boeing would eat, sleep, and breathe the world of aeronautics. And that was nothing. And Boeing was a shareholder, was a company with shareholders, incorporated in Delaware in the same way that most American
Yes.
companies are, under the same laws. But the people who worked in it had these different and immensely successful view of they were doing. So as I see it, the successful model of the company is not one that has a different legal structure from the one that has been from the shareholder uh, oriented corporation. Most of the great businesses we've been talking about have been shareholder corporations, but they've been run by managers who had broad senses of the obligations to a group of shareholders, and they were successful in the long run by satisfying the different needs of these groups of stakeholders, the customers, the employees, the communities in which they operated.
Great. Uh, the other aspect of this conversation is the startup community, where the entire environment is driven by investors who fundamentally demand shareholder returns as their primary goal, as the very nature of the way this model operates. Is there a way to introduce stakeholder models into that community?
I think these kind of businesses are naturally stakeholder models, and indeed, almost every startup business uh, brings in its early employees as shareholders in the business because they realize that everyone has a common interest in seeing the development of the business. I think when I'm not looking for new legal models for the way we operate companies, and I think Britain is a, an extreme case of this because In Britain, we are pretty good at startups. What we have been very bad at is scaling up these startups effectively. And if they've scaled up, they've either failed to scale up or they've scaled up by selling themselves to established companies in related businesses, or less frequently, by floating somewhere or other and turning themselves into more financially oriented organizations. I think, and this is, I think, most people's experience of startup companies. The way they work well is by everyone having in their minds a stakeholder model in which, if they develop great businesses that have, above all, satisfied customers and happy employees, they will generate quite a lot of money for shareholders in the process of doing that.
Do you see AI and digital technologies helping to create decentralized community-driven models? Because at this point, they seem to be we seem to be in the risk of further concentration of power through these technologies. How do you see them migrating to a more community-driven models?
It may be that I'm getting old, but I feel as I watch people promoting AI and talking about AI that I've saw all this before in 1999 when people told me endlessly how the internet was going to change everything about business. And the interesting thing is it did change everything about business, but it didn't change it on the time horizon that people in 1999 had in mind. And if you'd bought, I amused myself by looking at what would you have identified as the Magnificent Seven in 1999. Well, you would have got Microsoft, but that was the only one you would have got. The other companies on that kind of list either no longer exist or exist in attenuated form. Cisco, unbelievably, was in 2000 the most valuable company in the world.
Yes.
If you bought Cisco shares in early 2000, you wouldn't yet have got your money back. It's often said, and I think we can't say it too often, that we overestimate the short-run effect of technology on business and underestimate the long run. And I think that's true of AI. And I think we don't know. I don't believe anyone who says they do know what the effect of AI on business is going to be. But I feel very confident in saying that we'll have to wait more than 5 years to see how it actually changes the nature of business. And of course, the answer to the key question, which you're asking, which is it going to change, and how will it change the nature of the relationships between people in workplaces? And I think how it changes the nature of these relations within the workplace and the relations between the people who work there and the customers will be the key question, which we will see answers to over a period of years and in ways we can't really anticipate at the moment.
So what I hear you say is that given enough time, these technologies tend to develop in manners which will be conducive to a more egalitarian development or egalitarian impact on society. Is that, do I understand you correctly?
I think it's not necessarily egalitarian, but it is true that AI facilitates the decentralization of power. A lot of people now seem to believe that one or two companies are going to control the development of AI. I think they will be as wrong in that assumption as the people who said the same about the internet in 2000. Remember these Cisco and IBM stories.
Would you say the same thing about the entrenchment of individualism, that given enough time and engagement with some of these issues, they will resolve themselves and settle down into a more communitarian direction?
That may be true a bit, but I'm not necessarily. Uh, we will all have to work at that. What we've been talking about is cultural shifts and changes that have occurred over the last 50 years. I think that uh, looking looking into history, the late 60s and the early 70s were really a turning point in which business changed, as I've described, from trying to create a cadre of professional managers with a sense of obligations to a variety of shareholders into an individualistic world of short-run profit maximization and financially oriented large companies. We've seen 50 years of that cultural change. My basis of optimism is to say that if we can have cultural changes of one kind, we can have cultural changes that are simply influential or similarly influential of another kind. And my aspiration in writing these books, having these conversations with you, is that we can say to try to start people thinking in ways that will bring about that cultural change.
So if I was to summarize what we are talking about, if we were to democratize the decision making of the current large corporations or governments, um, you've spoken of the fact that individuals, generally speaking, are not selfish maximizers and seek fulfillment through their relationship with others. So if that be true, if we are able to democratize the decision making in some way or the other, a lot of these issues would resolve themselves over a period of time. How do we mobilize that? How do we mobilize that idea within companies, governments, civil society to head in that direction?
I think we have to be careful when we talk about democratizing uh, the structure of corporations and the like. We are absolutely not talking about having some of the models people have described of worker control, unions on boards,
Fair enough.
etc. We're talking about professional managers who have the sense that they are trustees for a variety of stakeholders, and their job is to balance the interests of that variety of shareholder. Now that really is a cultural change shift rather than an institutional shift, and uh, businesses need to have some kind of hierarchy because decisions have to be made and people have to know what these kind of decisions are. But that does not mean you have the great man as big boss, and everything that happens in the corporation happens directly or indirectly as a result of the orders that emanate from the big boss. I've always liked the concept which Blair and Stout famously called the mediating hierarchy, in which people who join a business and know that they're signing up to a process that has a decision-making procedure that everyone will accept, but that the reason they do that is that the effective people in that business are building up a consensus for the kind of directions the companies should be moving in and the kind of things that it should be doing, and securing agreement on that, which means you have effectively cooperative teams working together. That's the role in the 21st century of the effective professional manager.
In our earlier conversation, you spoke about the education system and the media in building this great man concept. What steps do you think these institutions, whether they are educational institutions or media, what steps can they take in order to rebuild some of these trust and create a sense of shared purpose?
I think that's once again a cultural change that if I walk into a business school today, I hear people talking endlessly about about leadership, about strategy, by which they mean something that emanates from the top, and so on. I think we need to develop these institutions, but we need to develop them in ways which put a lot more emphasis on the way people work together in teams and the nature of an effective team and the kind of institutional structure and behavior that are characteristic of that effective team.
What about the media?
And the media, I think it will be difficult ever to get the media away from the good man idea. The journalist with a photographer behind to photograph the great man in his office is going to be a permanent feature of the world, of our world. But a lot of businesses work very well with what I've called the myth of the founder. I mean, good examples would be Thomas Watson of IBM or Simon Marks at Marks and Spencer, of people, of how people create a largely imaginary scenario about how this person encapsulated the values of the organization. And if we're talking about IBM as it used to be, or Marks and Spencer as it used to be, we know we're talking really about the ways in which the people who worked there together thought about the business that they were working for. And if they want to think of that as what would Simon Marks or Thomas Watson have done, or indeed what would Walt Disney have done, that's fine. But that's not the reality that you're waiting for some great figure like that to come and tell you what to do.
Would you suggest that if we were to move to a communitarian society, let's say 10 years from now, what do you think would it look like to you, and what would have to change to get us there? We spoke about some of it, but just trying to understand what's the path to a future communitarian structure, both from a business, political, and social contexts.
Well, I think it will have businesses that recognize they have multiple obligations to many shareholders. I think it will have a political structure that discards the sharp left-right spectrum and axes that were politics for so long. And it'll be a society that realizes how important and fundamental it is to establish community institutions that are bigger than the individual and the family, and yet smaller than governments and states. It probably has a lot more decentralized political power than we see at the moment. That's my vision of a more communitarian society.
Fantastic. Would you, before we close, would you like to talk about your upcoming book a little bit, just to give us an understanding of what you were writing?
What I'm most concerned about now is to elaborate this idea of developing professional management, to go back to what we were starting to try to do in the first half of the 20th century, but largely gave up in the second half in the interests of pursuing great men and shareholder value, in which we have this communitarian view of the nature of business, professional management, learn how to do that and how to do what is the most important job, I think, of the management, which is to create great teams of people who work together to a common, a shared purpose, and whose aspiration is to create great businesses that will still be around decades from now, doing things which may turn out to be very different. That was the story of 20th century ICI or 20th century Boeing or some of the great businesses which I've talked about. And I would like to see management dedicated to businesses, building great businesses which will stand the test of time and changing technology.
Any companies that come to mind who are, treading this path at this point?
I'm reluctant to give an example because it's so easy to prove myself wrong. You mentioned Unilever earlier in this conversation, which is an interesting example of company that's veered in various directions over the years. I think what is true is that businesses in fast-moving consumer goods, whether they're goods producers like Unilever, or whether they're supermarket chains, which they have typically been more effective because of their obligations to be responsive to consumers, have been better able to do this job of managing and balancing stakeholder interests and than many of the more production-oriented businesses which have characterized business in the latter part of the 20th century and earlier part of the 21st. I think it's in large part there that we need to look at, that we need to look for examples.
Would you suggest then that the closer you are to the consumer in terms of the service that or product or service that you're delivering, the more likely you are to be more communitarian or more non-leadership as a great man leadership oriented approach?
I think that is true at the moment, but I would wish to move to a world in which it was not as true as I believe it is today.
Professor K, I'm absolutely looking forward to your new book. Thank you so much for such a thought-provoking conversation. Across these two episodes, we've traveled from understanding why individualism endures to exploring what a more communitarian future might look like and how we can get there. Your ideas challenge us to rethink how we lead, how we govern, and the kind of society that we want to build. On behalf of Founding Fuel and our listeners, thank you so much, Professor K. Thank you for joining.
Thank you. It's a pleasure and stimulating to have this conversation with you.
Thank you, Professor.